as a former Roman Catholic who used to do like Eucharistic Adoration and stuff, what's the difference there? Okay, so that's sort of the deification of the material world there, which is kind of what informs our theology of icons, if I'm not mistaken. So what's the difference? Why is there no adoration in the Orthodox Church? And why is the veneration of Christ, the material that Christ took on, different?
So in Holy Week, we do adore the Eucharist, technically speaking. So it does occur once during Holy Week. But the reason that we don't do that is that that is a later Roman Catholic innovation to separate the adoration of the Eucharist from the communal liturgical celebration. And since that's a post first 1,000-year innovation, the Orthodox Church never did that. It doesn't exist. And so I know that some Western Rite people try to defend the practice, but we don't need to do that because, number one, it's never intended to be separated from the communal celebration of the liturgy. It's that simple. And to separate it and make it this thing where you go and you stand in front of the Eucharist and pray in the pews for an hour for, what do they call it, Eucharistic Adoration, and to make reparations. Those are all just second millennium Roman Catholic innovations. That's it. It's not part of the Orthodox tradition because it's never divorced from the liturgy, and that's precisely what adoration does. And by the way, even in Holy Week, when we adore them, they're not divorced from the liturgy. It's still part of the liturgy.
So really, it's just as simple as Christ commanded us to eat the Eucharist, and that's that.
Well, the attitude of the Orthodox, the attitude of the Orthodox Church was always that there's no like parts. Like you can't have half a liturgy. Like there's the liturgy, and the liturgy is a holistic exercise, and it concludes always with the reception of the Eucharist. So it just doesn't make sense to take only the adoration of the Eucharist out of that holistic service. It just doesn't make sense.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I had another question.
Yeah.
In the first the first few chapters of the first book of Exposition of Orthodox Faith. So when John of Damascus is giving, I guess you could call them arguments, he actually calls it a tradition handed down it's sort of an argument from movement, and I know you talk about this a lot. My question is, what good is an argument like that if, especially if we're trying to use it for unbelievers, which is kind of, let me start over. He gives the argument saying that there are those who reject Scripture. So we have this line of reasoning. He doesn't say that exactly, but we have this handed down to us. I guess my question is, what good is that to us if...
Right. So yeah, it's a great question. So notice that in the Fount of Knowledge, at the beginning of Fount of Knowledge, he gives a transcendental argument. So he's open to both approaches. And remember that in the ancient and medieval world, they didn't have the Enlightenment yet. So they were not yet challenged on the metaphysical assumptions. That doesn't come until Descartes, Hume, Kant. Then you have the question of, hey, are you putting the cart before the horse? Are you claiming to have knowledge of things in metaphysics that you haven't yet justified in an epistemic sense? So the shift has not yet happened at that point. It doesn't happen until the Enlightenment. So we can't expect ancient and medieval philosophers to answer Enlightenment questions. It's just not going to happen. They just did not yet think that way. For example, one of the things that starts happening in the 1700s, 1800s is the rise of linguistic philosophy. And this becomes its own branch of philosophy. Would we say, oh, well, I guess we can't do linguistic philosophy. We shouldn't ask those questions because nobody in the ancient and medieval world asked them, right? It's just something about that. That doesn't seem right, right? Like, why wouldn't? Of course, you can do linguistic philosophy. It's why not, right? And so the fact that they didn't do epistemology first or ask paradigm level questions does not mean that paradigm level questions aren't worth asking. So if we were in a world where we had a general attitude of acceptance of metaphysics, like the ancient and medieval world had, it wouldn't be as bad a move to say, well, look, here's causation. Surely there's a first cause, because everybody's operating kind of on the same basic presuppositions. But after the Enlightenment, people start to question all presuppositions. That's what Descartes' exercise is. And of course, Descartes didn't put the question mark down far enough. And so this leads to radical skepticism. And basically, as we just saw at the beginning of this talk, when I went through Quine's essay, the main point of Quine's essay is to reiterate the fact that empiricism can't justify itself, and especially linguistically. When it gets into predication, meaning, Quine's point is that science can't work without both the analytic and experiential stuff, because language is part of science, symbolism, math, logic, manipulating symbols, that goes into science. How can you do that without experience? So the point is just simply that they didn't ask those questions in the same way that they didn't have calculus. Okay, did they have Leibniz and whatnot, his calculus back in the ancient medieval world? No. So would we say, oh, well, I guess we can't do calculus because Aristotle and Aquinas didn't have calculus? No, that's just silly, right? And in the same way, right, you can't expect them to have knowledge of or ask questions that weren't asked yet. So I would say that you're right. Strictly speaking, I don't think John Damascus's bare argument from just causation is going to go very far with today's post-Enlightenment philosophers, right? They're not going to accept that. Right. But he does make a transcendental argument at the beginning of Fount of Knowledge, which would apply to all of today's goober philosophers who are relativists and subjectivists, right? So that would be my answer to that.
Okay. Thanks, Jay.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Sure. Anytime.
Hey, Jay.
Hey, what's up?
Hey, so just had a quick question. I've been doing some research recently, and I was wondering if you had any recommendations on ante-Nicene fathers talking about the liturgy specifically, or Father Deacon, if you have any recommendations, I'd love to hear them.
Well, I mean, there are the ancient liturgies, so you could go read the liturgy of St. Mark, which does derive from the first few centuries. We don't know the exact date, but that's from whence it arises. You could probably read something on the ancient Roman liturgy. I'm sure there's plenty of books out there about that. I don't know if we have I don't know what the earliest liturgical text for the form is. And then church fathers commenting on it, it's kind of sparse, so it's kind of like here and there. So, Irenaeus has sections in Against Heresies where he mentions the liturgy. Justin Martyr has sections in his main books, Against Trypho and his Apology, where he mentions the liturgical ceremony, but it's very minuscule, right? I mean, Didache and a couple other documents will mention them kind of in passing, but the point is that there's not actually a pre-Nicene like church father treatise on the liturgy. It doesn't exist. I mean, they're just kind of mentioned in passing. I think Ambrose mentions the sacraments, so that would be relevant to the liturgy. I mean, he has like treatise on the sacraments or something like that. Cyprian will mention on the unity of the church and baptism and Lord's Supper, so he will comment on it. But are you asking, do the church fathers have a book on the liturgy in the first 3 centuries? No, they don't, because they weren't thinking in a where's the academic treatise on the liturgy, right? They weren't thinking in that way. They were living it and then writing based on the problems that arose in their day. So they didn't do academic treatises on the liturgy in the first and second century. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
But now you could find modern day scholars who will do history of liturgy. So there's Hugh Wybrew's book, The History of the Byzantine Liturgy. There's the Williams and Anstall book on the early liturgy coming out of the temple and the synagogue. Those are 2 books that are pretty well known.
I had a question about the sinless nature of the Virgin Mary. Like, how does that work?
Well, she's like the new Eve. So she's like Eve was in the garden. So when we say that her, quote, nature is sinless, it's just to say that she is by grace restored to the status that Eve was in so that she could be the mother to Christ, and that he could derive his human nature from her without getting the taint or the corruption of Adam's sin passed on. So that's why she's the pure virgin.
Okay. Is there anything I can read about that, like, further, or?
Well, I mean, there's St. John Maximovich's little book on the Virgin Mary, but like, what specifically is the area of problem for you?
Just the whole concept. Like, I was just confused on how Adam's sin, like, couldn't be passed on to her. Like, I don't know how that would, be prevented.
Well, so saying Adam's sin is passed on means different things at different times. So sometimes it's a reference to the nature lacking grace, and sometimes it's a reference to our actual sinning like Adam did as our forefather. So there's actual sin and then there's original sin or ancestral sin. So what we're saying about Mary is that the Orthodox, we would say that because she died, she did possess ancestral sin. But by grace, we would say she was preserved from committing actual sins. So that's why
that makes a whole lot more sense to me now.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
I appreciate it.
Right. So we have the Feast of the Dormition of the Virgin, and Dormition is referring to her passing away, going to sleep, dying.